Hi, I'm Howard Tiersky, author of the book Winning Digital Customers, The Antidote to Irrelevance. This video is a supplement to the book, so I assume if you're watching this, it is because you have a copy of this book and you have been looking at the part of the book that goes into depth on how to use different types of data and data analysis to better understand your customer and are now interested in learning a little bit more about benchmarking data. So that's what this video is about, and we're going to go into a number of things, 5 key factors that you need to consider when trying to use data for benchmarking purposes. Really important things to understand, because lacking this information, you could try to use data to do some benchmarking and be led to the wrong conclusions, possibly even the opposite conclusions of what really reflects reality, and I'm going to explain to you in a moment why that is. If for any reason you have somehow found your way to this video and you do not have a copy of the book Winning Digital Customers, well, you should get one. For one thing, because this book is a bonus to this video, I should say, is a bonus to that book, so it's really expanding on content in the book. I'm assuming you've seen the content that's in the chapter in the book on using indirect customer research, and also because, man, it's sure a good book, so you should check it out. You can find it on Amazon or go to winningdigitalcustomers.com for more information about the book and locations to purchase it. Okay, on the assumption that you have a copy of it, or hopefully many copies of it, let's talk about benchmarking. So first of all, what is benchmarking? Benchmarking is using data to compare two different things. You could argue if I weigh this apple and I weigh that apple and I notice that one is heavier than the other, that's a very simple form of benchmarking. I'm just finding a data element, weight, to compare across two different things. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, in business, benchmarking can be very, very helpful when trying to understand the difference in performance between two different websites or two different stores or two different products or two different salespeople. There's lots of different things that you might want to benchmark. And why would you want to know the difference in performance between two different things? Well, usually it's for really one of two reasons, although honestly they're kind of two sides of the same coin. First of all, if you have a bunch of stores and you realize through benchmarking that one of them is performing far worse than the other stores, or you have a bunch of different product categories on your website and one of them has conversion that's far worse than the others, or in any scenario, you discover that you have outliers that are not performing as well as you expected. Or if you have your own company and you get external data sources that tell you that the customer satisfaction that your customers have is lower on average by a good margin than what most of your competitors have, well, that's important information because it points to a problem, something that should be dealt with if you're seeing a substantial reduction in performance in some key area compared to what a lot of other seemingly similar entities are experiencing. And the flip side of that coin is, well, maybe when you benchmark, you discover that you have a bright spot. You have 10 salespeople and they all sell about the same amount every month, but one of them sells 3 times as much as any of the others. Well, you probably want to find out what the heck is that salesperson doing, right? Is it a different script? Are they targeting customers differently? Is there a way we can learn from that and help everybody get better? Similarly, if you have certain products on your website that outsell all the others, do they have better images? Do they have better marketing copy? What can we learn from our best performing, whatever they are? If our best performing store is selling twice as much dollars per square foot as our average store, gosh, let's go look at what they're doing in that store. How are they getting such fantastic results? So that's really the power of benchmarking. Similarly, you can benchmark across time. You can say, well, how are my sales this month compared to last month, or compared to this month last year? Or how are my sales this afternoon compared to this morning? And that can be helpful because if you've changed something, maybe you made an adjustment to the way you sell or to your marketing or to the products you have available or what have you. Well, by looking at the benchmarking, you can determine, did it work? Did things get better? Did things get worse? And try to figure out the cause. And it's all really for the same purpose, which is to improve your business results, possibly also hopefully improve your customers' experience, and to do so by learning by comparing. If I only know the data for one thing, someone says to me, well, your store today sold $1,200 worth of goods. Is that good? Is it bad? It's hard to know. But if you compare it to how much that store did every day previous, and if you compare it to how other stores in the neighborhood did or other similar stores, now I can start to get a sense of if that store is doing well or not doing so well, and whether we should look to that store for practices we should be employing across all our stores, or whether we should try to figure out what's wrong with this store and what do we need to do to improve. So that's benchmarking and why you'd want to do it. But benchmarking has some caveats and challenges. In theory, what you'd like to do is be able to compare similar things and try to figure out how their performance differs. But there's some easy pitfalls in benchmarking that you really want to be thinking about, and just some other key factors that you want to think about when you start to apply benchmarking, because if you don't think about all these factors, you might be led to the wrong conclusions from your benchmarking, which might lead you to take the wrong action. If you use the benchmarking to think that store A is doing better than store B, and you start therefore taking all the practices in store A and doing them in store B, well, if it turns out that actually store B is doing better than store A, you may be going in the opposite direction of what you want. You're taking the practices from the worse store and applying them to the better store. Now, you might think, well, how would I do that? Well, let me talk about that. So we're going to talk about 5 key factors. The first factor that we want to talk about is, are you measuring the same thing? So here's what I mean. Let's say you're looking at 2 stores, and you're looking at the total sales of those 2 stores. And you say, okay, well, this store has $1 million in sales this year, and this store has $1.2 million in sales. It could be e-commerce stores or physical brick and mortar stores, it doesn't really matter. So you'd say, well, which one's better? Which one's doing better? Well, at first glance, the $1.2 million store, seemingly. But, it's funny because we use these terms like sales, and you might think, well, that's a pretty objective metric, right? We're just measuring sales. Obviously, the one that did more sales is doing better. But when you dig into any metric, what you often find is that there are interpretations that go into determining how that is measured. For example, let's take sales, one that you'd think, how much interpretation could there be? Well, for example, sales tax. Is that part of a sale? If I ring up your sale at $12 plus 30-cent sales tax or 50-cent sales tax or whatever it is in your area, do I count that as part of sales? Some people would count it, some people wouldn't count it. Now, does it matter that much when you're trying to track your sales over time, whether you include the sales tax or exclude the sales tax? It doesn't matter that much unless you're trying to compare between, for example, 2 different stores, and you discover that one store is calculating their sales with the sales tax and one without the sales. Or take an e-commerce site that charges for shipping. Well, do you include the cost of the shipping as part of the sale, or do you view that as separate? I've seen e-commerce sites do it both ways. So again, I might have one e-commerce site that's doing $1 million and another that's doing $1.1 million, but actually the reason that it's doing $1.1 million is that they're factoring in the cost of shipping. If you took it out, they'd actually be only doing $950,000. So you could come up with many examples of this, but this is the first thing, is to say, if we're measuring sales or revenue or conversion or satisfaction or whatever it might be, how are we defining that thing? So let me give you 1 or 2 more examples of this because it's so important, and then move on to the second thing. One of the metrics that is considered the most important metric to track for certainly in any kind of digital commerce experience is conversion. So for anyone who doesn't know, conversion is simply a ratio of all the people that came to this, let's say it's an online store, of all the people that came to your online store, how many bought? How many actually completed a transaction and checked out, right? So for example, if 100 people came to your store and 50 of them bought, we'd consider that to be a 50% conversion, which is excellent, by the way. Very few e-commerce stores have a 50% conversion. So if I'm trying to compare and saying, well, my e-commerce store gets a 20% conversion, how is that? Is that good? Is it bad? Well, you might say, get some data from someone like Internet Retailer that shows conversion rates, percentages for lots of different large online retailers. Or you might compare, maybe you have within your company a number of different stores, or maybe you just have friends who work for other online retailers and they're telling you their numbers and you're comparing them. And that might give you a sense of how well you think you're doing. How good is your conversion? Do you need to work on it? Are you behind or are you ahead or what? But here's the thing. Even though conversion is a ratio of how many people came to your site and how many people bought, there's a variety of different ways in the nuance of calculating that you can do it differently. Let me give you a couple of examples. Let's take returns. Let's say you had, use my analogy from before, 5 people on your site buy a product today out of 10, and another site only had 4 people out of 10. Well, it sounds like the site that did 5 out of 10 is doing better. So they have a 50% conversion. The other site only has a 40% conversion. But what if 2 days later, 2 of those 5 people actually return what they purchased? So net, you only have 3 people that bought and didn't return. Whereas the other site has 4 and none of them. Well, in theory, the end of the game, the site that has 4 actually wound up sort of with more number of sales that actually stuck. So when you calculate conversion, how do returns factor? I've seen some sites that don't factor it in. They say, well, we're really just measuring sales. We're really just trying to figure out of the people that came, what percentage bought it. We have a different metric maybe that shows us returns. But when we calculate our percentage conversion, we don't factor in returns. And then I've seen other sites that say what we do is we retroactively adjust the conversion. So if you were 50% conversion, conversion the day after, that the conversion for that day 2 weeks later might get adjusted, because if something that was purchased on that day was returned later, we actually adjust that conversion down. So when we look at the conversion over time, we're actually fixing, if you will, the conversion from that day, because we don't consider it conversion if it was returned. I've seen other sites that say, well, we actually look at it on the day that it was returned. So if we had 3 purchases that day, or let's use revenue as another example, we sold $100,000 worth of stuff that day, but had $10,000 in returns, we only count that as $90,000 in revenue, because it's $100,000 minus the $10,000 in returns. Whereas another site or another store might not consider that and adjust revenue in that way. So I'm giving you all these examples to just show you, first of all, that there are all these next level considerations that go into these calculations. And if you are just measuring one store, day over day, week over week, and you're always doing it the same way, well, then it might not matter that much in the grand scheme of things. If sales are going up, sales are going down, conversion is going up, conversion is going down, that's what's important, because that's what's going to give you the insight to know whether you're doing things that are right or you're doing things that are wrong. You made a change that actually made things worse or better. But if you're comparing between 2 things that were measured in different ways, that's when you get yourself in trouble. And that's an example of where you can draw the exact wrong conclusion. If I look at one site that is measuring conversion, I could have a site that has an 18% conversion that's actually doing a lot better than a site that has a 25% conversion if the way in which conversion is measured is different. One more example of that. If you're measuring conversion, well, it's the number of people who buy divided by the number of people who come to the site to look, right? Well, what if someone comes at 9 a.m. and then comes again at noon and then comes back again at 3 p.m.? Does that count as 1 person or as 3 people? It matters because it's a ratio, right? So if we only count you once and you buy, then that's going to give you a higher conversion. If we count every time you came back, well, obviously that's going to give you a lower conversion. You might argue, well, why would you count it that way? It's the same person. And I agree. And most sites, analytic packages, will not count that as 3 different people. It'll recognize, okay, the same person's come back, so we're just going to consider that one visitor who's shopping. That makes sense. But what if they come on Monday and then Wednesday and then Friday, and then don't buy Monday, Wednesday, but they buy Friday? How do you handle that? Right? Do you consider that the person, like that was one shopping session, so to speak, and you only count the visit on Friday? Or are you counting the visits on Monday and Wednesday as visits that didn't lead to a sale? And what if they come on the 1st of the month and the 15th of the month and the 30th of the month? The point is that there are judgment calls to be made about how you tune the math in your calculation of conversion. And I've seen companies do it many different ways. I've seen some that take a 30-day. Say if you come on one day and you buy 30 days later, we'll count that as 1 visit. And then if you come the 31st day, well, no, now we consider it a new visit. And again, if you're looking at day over day conversion, you may have to retroactively adjust something. It gets complicated, right? And the purpose of this video is not to get into all the weeds and all the nuances about the details of these calculations, but just to point out that just because one company is calculating conversion and another company is calculating conversion doesn't mean it means the same thing if they're using different rules behind how they calculate it. And the consequence of these rules is not necessarily trivial. It's not probably going to make a 50% difference, but could it make a 10 or even a 20% difference? Yeah, it could. So if you're looking at 18% versus 25% conversion, well, that's within the margin of error, so to speak, depending on what you know about the way the math behind their conversion and the business rules behind their conversion is calculated. So those are some things to think about. And all it really means is that when you're trying to compare numbers, what you have to ask is, how was this calculated? If someone says, well, our conversion is 27%, well, how do you calculate that? What do you consider a visit? What do you consider a purchase? Those types of things. Okay, I'm going to move on. I mean, honestly, I could keep talking about this, but I think you get the point. There's so much nuance to this. And, well, if you really want to understand the numbers, you have to understand what makes up the numbers. So let's talk about number 2. So the first was, are you measuring the same thing, right? The next question is, are you measuring it in the same way? What techniques are being used to measure? A couple quick examples. I've seen some sites that measure the number of transactions using like a Google Analytics or Omniture, some kind of a web analytics tool that calculates how many people completed the checkout process in a given day, let's say. And I've seen other sites that use some sort of transaction system, which actually looks at the money that went into the bank and how many times someone ran a credit card. And you'd think that would be the same thing, right? You'd think it doesn't matter. But in fact, it does matter. In fact, what you find is that none of these systems are perfect. And by the way, this is another question. What if you try to check out and you get a credit card decline? Does that count as a sale, not count as a sale? It might not count as a sale, but it might bring up a page that makes Google Analytics think that the sale has been completed, for example. Especially because sometimes the credit cards aren't run until after, some sites run your credit card right when you're checking out. Like processes, and then it says, great, I've run your credit card. But most don't. For example, Amazon does. You complete a checkout and it says, okay, order received, we'll send you it. And then later they run your credit card. It might be 10 minutes later, an hour later. Or if they're not shipping the same day, they might not actually run your credit card till a day or two after that. Well, what if they run your credit card and it declines? How does that impact, the way that is that part of what you measure? So that might sound a little bit like the first one. How do you define sales? But the reason I'm mentioning it here is because that can also screw up the method of measuring. Because if you're measuring based on how many people, if you're using a tool like Google Analytics or Omniture, and you're measuring how many people got to that last page that says your sale has been confirmed, well, some of those people might not actually have made a sale because their credit card might not process. So then if you're looking at the system that actually looks at the money coming in, you might realize that you're shy, that maybe 8% or 4% or 2%, it's not going to be 50%, but of your transactions never wound up in the bank. So again, it goes to the point that if I'm comparing, let's say I have a company where I'm trying to compare two different e-commerce platforms that two different teams are running, and one of them is measuring using a Google Analytics approach, and one is measuring using a transactional system, I might be led to the wrong conclusion about which site was doing better. Here's another example. Let's say you're measuring customer satisfaction. So you ask people on a scale of 1 to 10, how satisfied are you? And you say, well, last year, let's say you're measuring this over time. Last year it was an 8 out of 10. And this year it's a 7 out of 10. So it sounds like it's getting worse. Well, did you measure it in the same way? For example, could it be that last year you sent an email and this year you asked people on the phone? Could it be that the wording of the question was just a little bit different? If I ask you on a scale of 1 to 10, tell me how satisfied you are, and I ask you separately on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your satisfaction? You might think that's the same question, but you find that when you make those kind of small wording changes, you get small adjustments in the average response. Not an enormous, not from a 2 to an 8 or whatever, but could you go from a 6 to a 7? Yeah, you could, just by wording the question a little bit differently. So again, it's a question of not only making sure you're measuring the same thing as in item number 1, but really looking at how are you measuring. If you ask people something verbally, like on the phone, you generally get a slightly more positive response on average than if you do by email. And if you ask it physically in person, like looking at someone, you get an even slightly more positive response, most typically. Why is that? Because people like to be pleasers. If I'm in person with you and I ask you your satisfaction, you're less likely to complain. Of course, don't get me wrong, some people will complain, absolutely. But on average, statistically, you're probably going to have a little bit of a skew towards more positive. And then on the phone, for similar reasons, it's not quite as personal, but compared to, say, email or a paper form, you're going to have probably a slightly more negative response. So if you switched from asking people in person to asking people on paper, and you saw a reduction in satisfaction from year over year, let's say, that may not reflect any reduction in the actual satisfaction of your customers. It may only reflect a different way of measuring that yields a different result. So there are some examples where you have to look at what techniques are being used to measure. And again, so what are you going to do about that? Well, what it really means is that when you're comparing, you want to ask questions. And you want to say, well, how was this measured? What question was asked? What method of collecting the data was used? And most importantly, was it the same if I'm comparing between 2 things or 10 things or however many different data elements, data points I'm evaluating and comparing? How similar or different is the method that was used to collect the data? So that's number 2. Number 3 is who is doing the measuring. When the people that are doing the measuring have a vested interest in the outcome, I find the outcome is influenced. Now, I don't know if that's just because they have their fingers crossed when they ask the question, or they might word the question in a certain way or something, but I tell you that when you have an independent party doing an assessment and evaluation, you almost always get a less positive result, even if it's positive, than if you have the people who have a vested interest in the outcome. So number 3 is to just take a look at who's doing the measuring and are they truly independent? Because if they're not, or certainly if one is less independent than another in terms of comparing benchmarking, you again have something that could be biasing your results. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't look at the data, but you just have to know that you can't 100% trust it. And if the differences are small, you might want to say, yeah, given the differences in how this was measured, one was done by, J.D. Power or some other external third party, and one was done by, a person who works for the company. You just can't expect the same level of reliability in both of these cases, at least not most of the time. So that's number 3. Who is doing the measuring? Number 4 is less a matter of making the results incorrect, but more a matter of not being misled about what might be the root cause. And it comes down to what are the factors that might be influencing the outcome. So, for example, weather. Weather influences people's moods. If you ask somebody how satisfied they are with a restaurant meal on a rainy, dark, overcast day, they are likely to be less satisfied than if you ask them on a bright, sunny, beautiful. Nothing to do with the food, the service, the ambiance, the decor, anything to do with the selection, anything to do with the restaurant. It's just influencing their mood. Now, is that true for every single person you survey? No. But it's true for enough people that it can pull your results down a little bit. Of course, sales can also be influenced by weather. You know, if you say, well, we're measuring the amount of foot traffic we got in our store, most people know this, of course, and you say, well, gosh, last week we had 100 people come into the store. This week we only had 50 people. Well, if it's been raining all week, it may not be that you're doing anything wrong. It may be simply that, of course, you're going to get less foot traffic in the rain. That's sort of an obvious one. Of course, seasonality in general is an important thing to consider. If you're comparing your data from this month to last month, but you naturally might see a big difference just due to, for example, as you head into the Christmas season, a lot of stores have an increase in sales. So naturally, you can't expect your January sales to be the same as your December sales. Now, again, these are things a lot of people realize. Seasonality is kind of an obvious one, but let's take another one. Product availability. Sometimes you discover that your products that are selling the best, you have more of an out-of-stock situation, and that may be causing fewer sales because people come into your stores or they come to your website or whatever and they can't buy it, especially if you have a site or a store that sells a small number of products, because then if one or two products are out of stock, it can have a significant impact. Now, that may be actionable, right? Understanding that to say, oh, well, we need to do something about that, but it might be beyond your control. It depends on where you get your products from. The point is, the fourth factor is to make sure that you're looking at external factors that could be influencing these results before you conclude, oh, the store is doing something wrong, or oh, some change that we introduced on the e-commerce site is causing these results. There may be external factors, and you at least want to look to see if you can see a pattern or you can see an external factor that may be causing influence. And the last one I want to talk about is trying to figure out, okay, so therefore what is the root cause? In other words, let's say you're good on all these other categories. Let's say you look at how you're measuring conversion on your website, and you're comparing two different websites. Like, we work a lot with Avis and Budget Rental Cars. They have multiple websites that all rent cars, right? So let's say they're comparing the conversion across multiple websites that are all renting cars. And they say, nope, we calculate conversion the same way. We're not doing any of that nonsense Howard talked about earlier. We use the exact same system, the exact same method, the exact same way of counting visits and sales. And we use the same method of determining whether refunds are included. All those stuff, it's exactly the same. And furthermore, it's being done by an independent system, an independent party. And furthermore, we know that we've looked at the factors, and frankly, the factors are probably the same, right? If it's wet or dry, or if the economy is down or up, it's probably affecting, all of our different car rental websites similarly, because we're going to look at the data that way. Okay, great. Then what you want to do is say, all right, so if I see that a website's doing worse over time, or I see that one website is dropped compared to another website, how do I actually figure out what the root cause of that is? Because that's really what's actionable. If I know that website A has just declined in its conversion compared to website B, it's good to know. But in order to do something about it, such as to get website A back up, I need to know why. Is it the design? Is it the speed? Is it the products? Is it the text, the copy, the images, what is it? What's the problem? You might want to look to things that have been most recently changed. That's certainly one thing to look at if you're looking at things over time. But here are a few other things that you can do. One of the number one things we do, and we talk in detail about this in the book, about a project we did around looking at some problems with people misentering credit card information in checkout forms, where you have data that points you to a problem, but it's not clear sort of what the problem is. It just shows you that something's wrong. The sales are down, but why? So one thing we like to do is observational research. If we know, for example, from the data that we've seen a big decline in the number of people that check out, people put stuff in their put stuff in their checkout cart, in their shopping cart, and then fewer people are checking out and actually completing the transaction that they used to, but we don't know why, we'll get some subjects into a lab, or we'll use an online testing tool, and we'll observe the process that they go through. And if necessary, ask them questions when they get to that point to try to understand, well, what happened? What's the problem here? Because through that kind of qualitative observational research, we can sometimes come up with a theory. If we start to see, oh, people are getting confused about the way that we calculate our sales tax or our shipping charges or things like that. So essentially, just by watching people go through, and you'll see in the book, there's a lot discussed about methods of using observational research. So that's one method to try to figure out what's causing it. Another is just looking at the data in a more sliced down way. By that I mean, kind of best to illustrate through an example. Let's say that your traffic is reduced. You used to have 1,000 people a day visit your e-commerce site, and now you're down to 800. Well, one of the first things you want to look at are the traffic sources, because some of the 1,000 people you were getting were coming from social media, and some are coming from Google, and some are coming from just people typing in the URL, and some coming from links, from advertising, and other places. And so you want to say, well, when we had 1,000, where were they coming from, and where are they coming from now? In other words, let's slice down into the data, because we may discover that we're getting just as many people from Google as we ever did, and we're getting just as many people from social media as we ever did, but we're getting fewer people clicking on our ads. That's really the reduction. The whole 200-person reduction is from that. Well, now I'm starting to hone in. Okay, it's probably not an SEO problem. It's probably not a social media problem. Or maybe the problem is in multiple areas. Some areas are fine. Maybe some areas are even increasing, while other areas are decreasing. The last thing you'd want to do is jump to the conclusion that it's an SEO problem and start changing your SEO, meaning search engine optimization, when in fact you may find that your SEO is better than ever, but there's been a huge drop in the amount of traffic you're getting from Twitter. And then why? Now you can zoom in and say, all right, what's going on Twitter? Why am I getting less traffic from Twitter? And then there's a variety of things you could do to slice that traffic up and say, well, is it global, or is it only in certain countries? Is it all types of people from Twitter, or is it only people coming from our ads on Twitter versus people who are clicking organically from Twitter? Things like that. So we basically then want to slice down into the thing and try to figure out where's the problem. And usually when you start to slice it down, you can try to figure out what that is. And so some combination of the data and the observational research, because not everything is in the data, right? If fewer people are buying products in your stores and you can't figure out why, sometimes you just need to follow some people around your store, and try to figure out what's the issue. And that will often lead you to good hypotheses. Not always. Sometimes things maintain mystery. We've seen companies that have a drop-off in an important KPI, and we're trying to figure out why it dropped, and we're not really figuring it out, and a month later it goes back up. And we're like, man, we never really did figure out where that drop came from. That happens too. So don't be too upset if that happens to you. But just know that these are some techniques. I definitely encourage you to use benchmarking, but be sure you understand the caveats. Make sure that you are clear on whether you're really defining that specific stat, whether it's revenue or conversion or sales or average shopping cart size, or whatever it may be, that you're defining it in the same way. And if you're not, then apply the appropriate kind of caveat or fudge factor or margin of error to the data differences that you're looking at. Make sure that you are measuring in the same way, that you're not doing something different and therefore introducing differences. Make sure that it's being measured independently and you're getting data that's accurate and not biased. And make sure that the factors that may influence it that are outside of your control have been thought about, so you're not concluding that, oh man, we've really tanked our sales, and it turns out it's just the weather, And lastly then, once you have all that kind of sorted, there's a number of techniques you can apply